So I'll start with just introductions. Who am I? Why am I here? Why am I talking about this stuff? As I said, just really happy to be talking about EFFT and trauma. These are two topics very near and dear to my heart. I work in child and youth mental health, and for a number of years, I've worked almost exclusively with caregivers, family of origin caregivers, kin caregivers, foster or adoptive caregivers, and also teams of professional caregivers like child and youth counselors, caring for children and youth with complex or developmental trauma. I'm just really excited to share this passion I have for working with this population and share how I've found EFFT to be beneficial in the work I do. I'm not an EFFT trainer, so I'll not be training the ins and outs of EFFT. Rather, I'll spend our time together talking through how the components of EFFT can support the treatment of complex and developmental trauma. So a good place to start then, so we're all starting from the same place, might be to define our terms. That can always be helpful. What is trauma? When we hear complex trauma or developmental trauma, very easy for me to say, what's that mean? Do these terms just mean the same thing as PTSD, only worse or more, or what does that actually mean? And I would turn to, as I'm sure many of you have in the past, Bessel van der Kolk, who very eloquently helps us understand that it's not just what happened to someone, but trauma occurs when the body and the mind's ability to cope is overwhelmed. This is true for all types of trauma. What might be experienced as traumatic for one individual may only be a passing, well, that was tough, for someone else. Does that mean then that a person who's traumatized is weak? I would argue certainly no. I would say each and every individual person is resilient in some way, and some of us are lucky enough to have more fitting, appropriate, helpful resources, both internal and external, that meet our needs in a specific way and the specific challenging circumstance we encounter at any given time. So all that being said, there are a lot of terms flying around when folks start talking about trauma. And it seemed to me a helpful place to define or clarify what is complex trauma. And given I work in the context of children and youth, what is developmental trauma? And how do all the things play together? So these are some of the terms that we most commonly hear thrown around. So PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a good place to start with a definition, just so we know what it is and what we are talking about, what we're not talking about. So PTSD, psychiatric disorder, may occur in people who've experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, such as a natural disaster, serious accident, terrorist act, war, combat, rape, those who've been threatened with death, sexual violence, or serious injury. Symptoms may include intrusive thoughts, avoidance of reminders, traumatic event, reminders of the traumatic event, alterations in thought and mood, alterations in arousal. And PTSD is most commonly, though not always, addressed through trauma narratives. Often involves development of coherent story of self across time and place. It's a key part of self and identity work. There's a number of modalities that address this. Some may have heard of TFCBT. That's one of the sort of more widely known ones, particularly in the world of children and youth mental health. And it's best suited for those who've experienced single or well-defined events. And I want to jump to the bottom of the slide here and talk a bit about intergenerational trauma. And then I'm going to come back to complex and developmental because it's helpful to understand both sides before kind of defining those two things. When thinking about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about trauma passed down generationally. In part, that happens through messaging. So don't ask for help. It can be dangerous to ask for help. Or even things like emotions are bad, they need to be eradicated. And those could be overt told messages. They can also just be the context or the family environment where that is the culture of how things are raised. And that can get passed down generation to generation. Intergenerational trauma is also passed down through the body. And that most easily understood when we think about epigenetics. And epigenetics, of course, come through our genes, and they contain, so our genes, DNA, we inherit from our parents. Help us contain, or help us? No, they, let me just find my place again. They come for the development of certain traits. Genetics, like having a light switch, can be switched on or off by your environment. And when you think about epigenetics, that's what happens in an environment where things can be incredibly stressful or a lot going on. If you think in the context of war or famine, anything like that, anything ongoing, you can impact the gene expression of any particular given person. And in that context, that can be passed down for up to 3 generations, even if the future generations haven't experienced that specific event. So that is part of how things can get passed from generation to generation. Why is that important? Why do we need to understand that when we talk about complex trauma and developmental trauma? In the context of developmental trauma, caregivers or parents, they parent the way they were parented. We don't have a choice. This is what we learn. And we learn that these are safety-seeking behaviors, way to survive. And so we pass these on to our children to make sure that they survive and thrive. In the case of complex trauma or complex PTSD, individuals have faced either multiple stressors or chronic adverse experiences that may or may not meet the criteria or the threshold for PTSD. So things such as impaired caregiving, emotional abuse, or prolonged separation from a caregiver, as well as experiences of structural racism, low socioeconomic status, and other oppressive circumstances that are often inescapable and unspoken. These kind of really stressful things can lead to traumatic stress and ultimately complex and developmental trauma. For both complex and developmental trauma, those that have experienced multiple prolonged stressful exposures, so an example, a child whose life has involved chronic early neglect, unpredictable caregiving associated with caregiver mental illness or substance abuse, repeated acts of violence, separation from a biological parent, multiple out-of-home placements and attachment disruptions, re-victimization due to difficulty in negotiating relationships. In these instances, it's very difficult to define starting and endpoint, which is a key distinction between this and PTSD as well. Developmental trauma is a more multifaceted diagnosis or a proposed diagnosis, and it's specific to children. It encompasses 15 possible symptoms across several domains. It includes emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and relationship type symptoms. Symptoms includes behaviors such as habitual self-harm, extreme distress, and verbal or physical aggression toward others. Developmental trauma covers adversity not described in PTSD, much like in complex trauma, and also accounts for the disruptions in development that result from sustained trauma during childhood. And in the context of developmental trauma, that is most typically within the context of relationships, particularly close caregiving relationships. Children who've experienced complex developmental trauma have been exposed to recurring chronic stressors that activate the parts of their brain responsible for survival. And these parts stay activated and are focused on survival. As with any recurring pattern, when children experience repeated and similar sources of stressful input over time, their brains develop increasingly efficient patterns of response to help them cope with and manage these stressors. So the patterns of response can be behavioral, as we talked about before, such as taking action or stilling. They could be affective, big surges of rage or shame or fear. It can be cognitive, shifts in cognitive focus, specific meaning making around cues or experiences. And they can also be physiological, so increases in arousal or decrease in arousal, muscular tension, things like that. And they can also be relational. You can have shifts in patterns of approach or avoidance inside any kind of relationship, not just those caregiving relationships. These patterns of response have developed to serve a function in the brain of the child. In essence, the function is survival. And as such, they're often rigid. These patterns become very, very rigid and automatic when elicited by pertinent cues. So prominent themes associated with developmental trauma, or simply referred to as triggers, where people have often heard that term or use it, and it applies here. They're cues of potential danger. They include, or certainly not limited to, things like shame or loss, vulnerability, deprivation, helplessness, loss of control, isolation, mistrust or betrayal, injustice, attachment disruption, invasion, violation of boundaries. Those can be emotional or relational or physical. And importantly, the detection and response of these themes, it doesn't actually require their presence. It's just their perceived presence in a particular individual that can cause these to be triggered. In other words, if a child's brain decides that rejection exists, then the pattern of self that developed for that self-protection in the face of rejection, it'll emerge, it'll come out, regardless of whether the rejection was actually there. It's just how the person perceives it. And this particular disorder, as I say, recommended diagnosis, where kids are in here, their kids are fundamentally insecure. There's something, they really believe there's something wrong with them because they're either in emotional turmoil or emotionally shut down. They don't know how to get their needs met, particularly within close interpersonal relationships. And what we see is in kids in these circumstances, by school age, these kids may experience impulsivity, aggression, separation anxiety, and intense mood shifts. They're likely to face problems with sleep, learning, classroom behavior, relationships with peers. And when we talk about getting into adolescence, they may turn to addictive behaviors such as self-injury or substance use to cope with their emotional turmoil or to feel something when they're emotionally shut down. Diagnosis, we often see things like ODD, ADHD, bipolar disorder, major depression, myriad of attachment disorders written down on paper, whether real or just written down, adjustment disorders, anxiety, personality disorders. These are all diagnoses that could very well apply because they describe a cluster of behaviors and patterns. In the context of complex developmental trauma, though, the researchers behind this argue that just those labels don't accurately capture the kids' experiences and help us understand in a really fulsome way what could be going on for a child or a youth. So to better understand this, sometimes it's helpful to ground in something, a particular kiddo. So let's look at a snapshot in time with an adolescent and her caregiver to help us understand what all of this might look like in a seemingly innocuous space and time. This particular example that I'm just going to talk us through very briefly is taken from Leblowstein and Kinnenberg's 2018 book. It's the Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency Model for Treating Traumatic Stress in Children and Youth. And I'm going to take it from there for the sake of protecting the confidentiality of any clients I've supported through the years. And I use this example in particular as it's a scenario I've heard countless times from caregivers and directly from the youth themselves about how things tend to go sideways for them out of the blue. So I'll just read through it here. Elle's aunt, who is her legal guardian, has picked her up from school and is driving her to an appointment. Elle, who's 13, by all appearances is content and she's settled. She begins to tell her aunt a story about something that happened at school that day. Her aunt is focused on the road and midway through the story fails to respond to a question Elle has asked. Elle becomes enraged, yelling and calling her aunt an expletive. We can all imagine the colorful language that could come here. When an aunt begins to set a limit, calm down, I'm trying to drive. Elle shouts, stop yelling at me. She then unlocks the car door and begins to open it. She's threatening to jump out, even though the car is still in motion. So we go from calm, cool, collected to jumping out the car and yelling and swearing with a very minor trigger from our perspective, looking at the outside. So in this particular example, we have Elle's behavior. It clearly stems from more than what happened there in the present moment. Without needing to know every detail of Elle's history, we can see the impacts of the themes of perceived rejection, associated shame that comes with that, loss of control and potential danger. And in the face of these cues, Elle shifts from being relatively in control and sharing a positive experience into rage, increased arousal, danger avoidance, and preemptive rejection. These reactions are elicited by the present moment, but they're driven by the past. They come from before. One of the larger research studies out there that many have heard of is the ACEs study, or the study of adverse childhood experiences, which was completed by Kaiser and Permanente. And in this groundbreaking study, they were able to tie together some of the greater impacts of trauma. And I'm going to tie it all together, I promise. So some of the greater impacts, such as disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, and the impact on life expectancy and physical ailments. And this is not an image from that study. However, it is an image that I at least find helpful to draw your attention to some of the specific things. And when we're not talking about medical treatment, when we're talking about emotion-focused family therapy, some of this is relevant, quite a lot of it actually. So I'll draw your attention here, just moving things around on my screen so I can get to all my fancy tools. Specifically when we're talking about physical impact and where EFFT is going to help us out is when we think about brain architecture. So you see shrinkage in the prefrontal cortex. We're going to talk about why that's important. And then a large and more reactive amygdala. So much more rapid firing danger center in the brain or alarm system. You also have your neural pathways. So there's a need to rewire our brain to deal with the old thought patterns and habits of mind and more of that reactivity that comes along super, super quickly. And also the nervous system. You have a supercharged sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system that's not quite as engaged or not quite as reactive. It doesn't come online quite as quickly to bring the body back into balance. So these things are important, and we're going to come back to this as we talk more about EFFT. So here we're just doing that high level highlight of, these are some of the things that are happening when we're talking the context of complex and developmental trauma. So as I mentioned, Christine Kinneberg and Margaret Blaustein's model of the ARC framework. I work inside this framework. And while I won't go into depth here, I did want to share this. I find the brief overview to help as an image of the house we see here. It really helps conceptualize where and how we work toward healing when we think about any child or youth, or really any individual that struggles with complex or developmental trauma. So I'm just going to walk us through, as they say, very briefly, layer by layer here. Our attachment layer, which is part of the house that comes along with the ARC framework. Here it's seen in green. The colors actually aren't relevant to this particular model. It's just a helpful image I find, because I like colorful things and things I can put together. So the green here is our attachment layer. And you see it becomes the very foundation of healing, particularly in the case of complex developmental trauma, because healing happens within the context of safe, nurturing relationships. And you'll note the blocks identify what's required from a caregiver to make that happen, managing their own affect, being attuned to the needs of their loved one, and also effectively responding in any given moment. Then we talk about regulation. On top of attachment, then we start to build up as we build an individual, and we talk about their regulation. When you're talking about complex and developmental trauma, this is an area, a significant challenge for many, many individuals that are struggling with this. It's an area that needs to be addressed fairly overtly in a really targeted way. And then as we continue to move up here and we see the competency layer, we talk about executive functions, self-development and identity, relational connection. These are all the things that people usually want to start to work on. These particular areas are what people tell us to fix when they send folks into treatment. You'll note that this layer, the blue layer, is actually on top of these two. And that's why I like this image so much, because it really shows how things build upon each other. I lose my spot again. These are the things that happen to me. When you're talking about competency, it really can't develop in a meaningful way without these other two layers being in place in a good enough way. We don't need perfection. Perfection is not the goal, but we need our attachment layer to be quite secure, but good enough, and also a regulation layer to be working in a good enough way that we can slow down and actually focus on some of the competency layer here. And finally, as you look up, or not finally, we haven't addressed the orange there, but as we talk about this, the roof of the house, you'll notice when we're talking about trauma treatment, we often hear things like trauma processing. And in the context of ARC, we're actually talking about trauma experience integration. So I'm going to go through what the difference is and why that's important in the context of complex and developmental trauma. Kinneberg and Blaustein's model help us see how all these moving parts, that's all of these things, ARC calls them the building blocks, but given that, you know, EFFT has blocks, I didn't want to use the word blocks to make everything confusing. So we'll call these components in this particular case. Really, the visual of the house and what they've created through their model is that indication that to make this happen, to really have your trauma and yourself integrated into one whole, these components need to be addressed and in place. And it becomes a very dynamic working relationship to try and make that happen. So here, when we're talking about trauma experience integration, the ultimate goal for treatment who've been exposed to chronic, complex, early traumatic experience is to build their capacity to harness internal and external resources in service of effective and fulfilling navigation of life across domains of functioning. So that's where we say, these are all the domains of functioning that can come along with someone, and we want to be able to improve functioning in all of these categories. Past experiences of an individual often interfere with and override a child's capacity to engage purposely in the present life. They're often going on with what could be happening or has happened in the past and looking through that lens at the current day. The current reactions are primarily driven by overwhelming biological mandate of safety seeking, elicited by perceptions of harm and lack of need fulfillment in their environment. For many children like Elle, who we were talking about in the car with her aunt, their past experiences influence present reactions in a way that's not fully contextualized in the moment. By continuing to be guided by these past things leading to those fragmented self states, they come out in response to feelings of danger, shame, rage, helplessness, and loss. And they're impacted by specific memories, whether that's an actual picture memory or word memory or just felt sense within the body. We see things triggered pretty dramatically. And we want to be able to address those in order to allow a child to engage in their lives, their current present day lives, in purposeful and goal-oriented and fulfilling ways. There we go. I had to do a time check, and apparently I lost my clock on my screen. So trauma experience integration is an integrative goal that's addressed repeatedly throughout treatment. So anytime we're working on any component inside the ARC model, we're actually working toward the trauma experience integration. So by doing any of these things, we're doing trauma treatment, which is sometimes what we see kids sent in for. So the foundational layer here on the bottom, these are components that you bring into every aspect of treatment. So your engagement, you're always working with the individual and the caregiver to be engaged in the process, offering psychoeducation along the way, and creating specific routine and rhythm within your session, but also within expectations, as that in and of itself helps to soothe the nervous system. So why do I show you this? We're here to talk about EFFT. We're here to talk about emotion-focused family therapy and complex developmental trauma. Wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. And thank you for bearing with me. I talk about this and I bring it in, and we're going to go back and forth between this and EFFT. I find ARC is one of the more user-friendly ways to understand, conceptualize, and gain direction in a circumstance of complex and developmental trauma, particularly when considering intergenerational patterns of trauma and ultimately caregiver blocks. But let's not put the cart before the horse. So let's keep going here. Now, this might be a familiar picture to those that have done some or had some exposure to emotion-focused family therapy in the context of how do we understand behavioral and mental health issues. And I put this up here really just to draw attention to many of the similarities between just how we understand the development of behavior and mental health issues from that trauma-informed or ARC-informed perspective and the EFFT perspective. So we talked about genes, we talked about epigenetics, temperament we haven't touched on, but in EFFT, we talk about the superfeeler. And temperament's something that's born into someone. And then if you have an individual that has an incredibly sensitive super feeler ability where they feel everything around them, and then they themselves feel all of their emotions in a big, 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 big way, that's going to influence their interpretation and ability to cope and regulate everything that's going on around them. And when you talk about social and cultural factors in life stress, these two can play a pretty significant factor as well. If we think about life stress just in the here and now, living in the context of a pandemic, I live in Ontario, and we are in our, I don't even know how manyth lockdown at this point in time, where we're all trying to survive in a context of just getting through the day when we can't get out and do the things we normally would, and all trying to be at home working and schooling and doing all the things and being all the people. So you may hear some noise in the background that is contributing fairly significantly to my life stress as I try and regulate my own nervous system here. But this is something that has a pretty dramatic impact. And if you think about stress and the impact on the caregiving system, a stressed out caregiving system is a system that is more likely to fall into problematic patterns of parenting. So an important thing to note. And then my family environment and emotional processing. These are two factors that come together to pretty dramatically impact, as all of these things do. And we're going to talk about how we can target those two things. Then there's other factors as well. So again, if you've been in some EFFT focused stuff, you may have seen this model of the tree, and there's a component missing on the bottom for a reason. I'll come back to that later. However, I use this as a way to understand when we see a child or youth that we suspect or we know as complex or developmental trauma, this is a way to understand where these behaviors come from. So EFFT supports us to address the emotional things that are going on for an individual. And these things we know contribute to the behaviors and attitudes. They really drive them. In the context of complex trauma and developmental trauma, we know that many of these things that are going on, these really deeply ingrained, really, really big, big emotions that are driving all of the things underneath, are really fed by a pretty ingrained view of self that may include things like, I'm not safe, I'm not cared for, I'm scared, I'm unlovable, I'm ignored, I'm not valued, I'm all alone, I am bad. That view of self really leads to a lot of these feelings, and they play off one another and exacerbate one another. In addition to that, those really, really negative views of self, you also have a worldview or a view of the world where an individual may perceive, it's a terrifying world. People only hurt you. Dangerous. The world's a dangerous place. No one can ever love me. I'm not important. There's no place for me. The world is not okay. And when this is the context, a child who's raised within an environment who can't meet their needs within their caregiving system, their tree may actually look more like this. So we have this beautiful tree up above the ground. And in the context of someone with complex or developmental trauma, their tree may actually look a little bit more like this. So if we revisit the idea of behaviors and attitudes as adaptations for survival, a means to have your basic human needs met, I find it a little bit easier to understand, visually where that comes from and why children and youth develop some of these behaviors or display symptoms that lead to diagnoses that we listed before. Not to say, as I mentioned, not that the diagnoses are wrong, they may just not give us the full picture of what's going on. So here, if we have adaptations for survival, that's why we develop the symptoms or behaviors or attitudes or things that we do. In this context of the tree, this tree has learned after a fashion that how to adapt to this craggy hillside. Its roots are bare, it's exposed to the elements, clinging to every nook and cranny they can. The branches are bent and twisted to maximize access to the sun and also protect it from the wind and the elements. So do children, youth, and adults who've not had the opportunity to heal from trauma develop behaviors to survive their environment. They adapt to act in a way that can get their needs met. So knowing that and understanding what it looks like, we come back to this. The two components that we know we can address with emotion-focused family therapy, and frankly, in therapy at all, are family environment and emotion processing. We can't change many of the factors that go along. Sure, we can have some impact on life stress. Sure, we can work to understand social and cultural factors, and those are very important to bring into your treatment. We can't change someone's temperament. We can't change our genes. We can't change the historical factors that have occurred within someone's family, but we can take some focus on emotion processing and family environment. Now, when you think about complex and developmental trauma or the family systems that come along with that and the individual presentations, there could be a lot going on. I don't know if anybody's received a referral and they have the alphabet soup of diagnosis beside their name, and they start listing off, behavior. This kiddo, has all of the things you could possibly imagine. And a way I find fairly helpful to conceptualize or to think through what could be going on, why there's so many things. These kids and youth can be a little bit like a field of dandelions. And yes, I definitely think in pictures. You may have come up with that theme at this point in time. I find this particular thing useful because they do come with this myriad of behaviors or problems, and they bring themselves to treatment to deal with those things, or more commonly in my experience anyway, they're brought to treatment or sent away to treatment to get these things dealt with. Just deal with all these dandelions in my lawn and get rid of them. I don't want to deal with them anymore. So the dandelion for me is even further fitting, is I can't think of any other plant around where I live anyway that's better at survival. And that's when we have a kid with complex and developmental trauma. They're tuned to survive in their environment, much like the dandelion. It's what we're all primed for. That's what behaviors and attitudes was developed in a bid to survive. The mighty dandelion has a complex root system underground, which we have to target if we want to minimize the number of dandelions that appear on our lawn. We're asked to fix these kids. We're asked to deal with them as therapists. And, if we just shaved off all these flowers on top, we're not actually going to have dealt with any of the problem. So if we just treat the symptoms and we don't understand them, that's why I go back and forth between looking at ARC and what is complex and developmental trauma, and then how do we treat it using EFFT, or EFFT at least as a piece of the puzzle. But knowing that all of these flowers, apparently I have a very dry throat. All of these flowers need addressing. And usually whoever has brought our young friend into treatment has said, do all the things, make this kid better. They just need to function like a normal human being. I don't want to do it anymore. We have to figure out where to start, and that can be a little bit overwhelming. So one of the absolute saving graces I have found through my dive into emotion-focused family therapy is the case conceptualization tool. And this is something that Natasha actually does periodic training around between the case conceptualization tool and behavior coaching. So I encourage you to check it out if you ever do get the opportunity. But this tool in particular really helps us laser in our focus on the who's, the what's, the how's, the where's, in what order, and helps guide us forward. So it helps us really identify who are the caregivers that we're going to work with, who has the most neurological power, how are we going to work with that particular individual, as well as resourcing other caregivers within the system to be able to bring them into treatment wherever possible. We also get to list out all the identifying problems and then rank order them. Always, of course, starting with safety. That always has to be where we start in any kind of treatment to make sure that the individual and everyone around them is safe as well, and the need for attention. So we get to list them out, and we're always going to start with number 1. So it gives us a guidepost. Where do we start? And then what are the behavioral strategies recognized as best practice or promising practice to address the problems or disorders? This can be one of the more challenging aspects of treatment, is sometimes we know that, say, exposure can be really helpful to, with someone with serious OCD or serious anxiety, both things that you can see in someone with complex or developmental trauma. We know that possibly putting them in that circumstance could overwhelm their system. So what do we start with? And figuring out then what behaviors do we start targeting, and then what kind of interventions do we do? And in the context of this webinar, we're not going to go through every little thing. That would be a lot to cover in an hour and a half, but there are lots of specific things that you could focus on. So these are the things then, as it says on here, whatever you list out here, whatever strategies, these are the things we're going to teach to caregivers and why we bring them into the system. We want them to implement them at home because they're the ones that are going to support the loved one, not you as the professional therapist in this particular circumstance. And from there, then it really lists out, as you go through the tool, how to create emotion coaching scripts for caregivers to respond to their loved one's resistance or whatever emotions come along. And then, of course, to support our caregivers to deal with whatever blocks come up for them. So this fantastic guidepost to help us when you have a field of dandelions and you have to know where to start. And the next thing that really helps me is really shifting your understanding of making things go away in the right here and the right now, and shifting your focus into changing trajectories. When you can think about changing a trajectory for somebody and you focus on what does it mean to make a 1% shift for an individual and for a family system, and how is that helpful in the long run? It's a hard place to go because you don't get big wins necessarily. Oh, there's the cat. Yeah, he sleeps on my desk. Welcome. That's Flower. When we can think in 1% shifts, that's actually how anything is going to get any better. And if you think about laying a map out in front of you and you take a compass and you open the compass to 1%, and then you take that 1% point and you start as we do here, and you go out this way and you go out this way, you end up in a very dramatically different place. You could be on different continents. You could be on one continent in the middle of the ocean somewhere else. So we take these cumulative effects that we build upon in treatment, and we rely on these continuing to move forward. So things build upon themselves, much like we saw in the building blocks of ARC, or those components that come along with it. It's really helpful to address those things, because as we start to address them, they can build and snowball and grow. So if we can shift our focus as the treating professionals onto 1% shifts and changing trajectories, we can actually come up with big wins. They're just going to happen a little bit farther down the road, or we're going to know we're going to go from here. We want to be here. What we really need to do is focus on getting here, and then here, and then here. So for me, that's a really helpful way to conceptualize how to get and the pace to get where we want to go. So I don't get completely overwhelmed by trying to pull up dandelions all at the same time. So I share that as something I have found incredibly helpful. Now, a little bit more. What we also hear when we have caregivers bringing kids into treatment is that in terms of emotion processing, we hear, oh, this kid is processing emotions all the time. They're always losing their marbles. They're always yelling at me. They're crying, they're weeping, they're going on and on and on. They're just all the time, emotion, emotion, emotion. And I think what EFFT does in a really helpful way is it helps us to understand, or emotion theory in general, is just because someone feels emotions intensely or they express emotion in a really explosive or unhelpful way, it doesn't mean that they're processing these emotions. You can have emotional expression without allowing your emotion to move through your body. So all too often then, and this is certainly the case when you're talking about complex and developmental trauma and how behaviors become adaptations, your painful experiences and overwhelming emotions, they're dealt with unhelpful coping strategies and maladaptive behaviors or problematic relationships to help soothe the soul. So when we think about EFFT and how it can be helpful, if we can reverse this or stop this from happening, or at least, slow it down or offer an alternative, and offer some targeted emotional support in the instance of painful experience and overwhelming emotion in the present time, we have opportunity here to be able to teach the body and the brain of the impacted individual the confidence and the skill to manage emotions and stress. And the more and more confident and competent they feel in this area, there's a no need, or at least a reduced need for unhelpful coping strategies, those maladaptive behaviors and problematic patterns. So again, emotion theory really supports this idea that to be able to give a targeted emotional support and focus on emotional processing, we can actually help an individual with complex or developmental trauma be able to integrate the self and be able to regulate in a different way and ultimately work on their self-development. So EFFT, how do we really get into the components here? So 5 main components that come along with EFFT. And again, I'm not going to train each and every one of these, but rather I do want to be able to talk through them and how they apply in the context of complex and developmental trauma so that we can think about it maybe in a different way or see how we can use it. So we have emotion coaching, behavior coaching, therapeutic apology, caregiver blocks, and clinician blocks. If you haven't had opportunity to go to a core training or advanced or whatever training in EFFT or any myriad of thing offer, I encourage you to. There's also rather a lot of videos and handouts on the Mental Health Foundation's website, both through the clinician and the caregiver section. So if you're looking for any more information on many of these, those are available. Here, we're going to start by talking about emotion coaching. So how is emotion coaching helpful? It's a script. We're just saying something to somebody. How is it helpful in the context of, first of all, it's not all it is, but when we think about what it is on paper, how is it helpful? So in the moment, in any given moment for any human being, we're talking about children and youth here, caregivers, verbal and nonverbal signals, they trigger a release of calming neurochemicals from the hypothalamus, which then bind to receptors in the emotion center of the brain, the limbic system. The fancy words make it seem effective, right? Like that's definitely a good thing we want to strive towards. Sounds very fancy. And it's true, it's very important. And we're going to talk a bit about how that works. So over time, when this happens really consistently, these efforts actually promote brain building activity to create connections between the frontal lobe and the limbic system. Really, really important to keep someone's thinking brain online when they're overwhelmed by emotion. So by using emotion coaching, caregivers can act as a temporary co-regulator while their loved one increases their self-regulation. Super important when you're trying to help someone to work on their own regulation. So why, if we think about ARC, why would emotion coaching fit? Or where does it fit? How does it all work together? Well, emotion coaching is really attunement. You're really, really being attuned to what's going on for an individual, why they're struggling with what they're struggling with. And you want to support a caregiver to be able to do this with their own affect, their own regulation really online, so that they can be really in control of their own nervous system responses. And it becomes very, very effective to respond to someone in this particular way in moments of stress and struggle, because it regulates their nervous system and helps them develop their own identification and modulation strategies. So if we take it back to the physical impacts, coming back to this graphic here, and we think about the impacts of trauma, and what we learned earlier, what we talked about a little bit, is the brain architecture in and of itself. So the shrinkage of that prefrontal cortex, which is where the thinking happens, and then that overactive amygdala, that rapid firing alarm center, those two things become disconnected, and the thinking brain actually isn't developed enough in the context of complex developmental trauma, and the amygdala is super, super reactive to everything going on in the environment. Everything around you, potentially, it could be a bear or a snake or something incredibly dangerous. And then the neural pathways, they get wired through that really attuned, consistent, or effective response. Emotion coaching gives us an opportunity to be able to build those neural pathways in a really meaningful way. And then the nervous system overall needs to be soothed. It needs to be supported to have that parasympathetic nervous system kick into high gear to help regulate, bring down, decrease arousal, or increase arousal if it's too low, to be able to help an individual regulate. So to talk through it then, what does emotion coaching actually do? Another way to look at it, again, pictures, very helpful for me in my conceptualization to be able to understand this thing. So up here, we have our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, where all that beautiful logic lives, and then our limbic system, the feeling brain, and our amygdala, of course. Forgive me. So what we know is when emotions become overwhelming, they take over the brain. The amygdala goes off, sets off this fire inside the brain. The feeling brain becomes disconnected from the thinking brain, and we call it survival brain. And there's lots of interesting things out there to help explain that in a really user-friendly way. And for the purposes of today, we'll call it now we're in fight, flight, and freeze. This is what's happening as soon as your emotion brain is taking over and your prefrontal cortex is offline. Your emotional instincts take over, logic and reasoning, not particularly supported in the context of complex developmental trauma when you have someone that hasn't yet learned how to regulate themselves. So emotion coaching in this context is like putting out the emotional fire in the brain. Emotional first aid. It's a way to reconnect with a loved one in a difficult time. So we have to remember the brains of our caregivers, or the brains of caregivers, are wired very closely together with their children's brains. That's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. Kind of no matter the quality of the caregiving relationship, it is simply true that their brains are wired together. Even when it seems like they're not listening to you. So even when it seems like kiddo is not listening to you as a caregiver in this particular moment, the child's brain is actually picking up the cues that are going on. They're coming through, the cues come through in your words, your tone of voice, in the body language. And emotion coaching helps their brains to release those neurochemicals, the calming neurochemicals, which help put out the fire. So super important, because someone's going to ask you, if I just say this to a kid, they're not going to be calm, cool, and collected. And I would say, you're right. You're right. One emotion coaching script is not going to put out the fire, and that's actually not our purpose or not our hope. What we really need to keep in mind in this context and help caregivers to understand is the purpose is not to put out the fire altogether necessarily, but rather to reduce the fire or create ourselves a pathway to get out of the fire. So we can increase flexibility. We can help our loved one do what they need to do not to be harmful, so they can keep themselves safe or get themselves moving. There's the short-term benefit that comes along as we can reduce the fire and make ourselves a safe pathway to get through. They give our loved one a safe pathway. The longer-term benefit, when we're using this consistently over time as an effective response, is that when we engage in this way, the brain repeatedly, it leads to the development of a bridge between the limbic system, where the emotional fires originate, and the prefrontal cortex, where the logic and the reasoning live. When the thinking brain and the feeling brain are connected, when they work in unison, we get a calm brain. And when we have a calm brain and we can think and we can choose and we can do things to soothe ourselves, we can have some flexibility in our thinking. And of course, that reminder, it doesn't mean we go from 100 to 0 and lickety split inside one emotion coach. It's not the goal. We want to be able to bring it down slowly and reduce the harm. So this, by contrary, of course, something that we often find ourselves saying, or certainly we hear caregivers telling us, to tell them to calm down, just calm down. And I would just offer that reminder that the very sophisticated scientific evidence has concluded that never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. So again, we come back to the effective response of why emotion coaching versus just saying, just calm down, you're fine, just calm down, can be helpful. So what is it? How do we do it? Here are the steps that come along with it. First, we have to validate, and then we can support. First, we have to convey that understanding of our child or teen's experience and perspective. You have to show that you get it. You can understand why. And then we can support. Even the emotional support part will happen more readily. It'll be more easily accepted if first we have validated in a really meaningful way, and then we can practically support. So if we go back to Elle, who's sitting in the car with her aunt and losing her marbles, what may have been helpful for the aunt is to be able to respond with an emotion coach in that moment when Elle was really escalated. And perhaps the aunt could have said something along the lines of, Elle, I can understand why you're so angry with me right now, because this is such an exciting thing for you today. Because when I didn't answer you right away, I bet you thought I wasn't listening. And because you really needed me to share this joy with you, I totally get it. You have every reason to be angry and hurt. And as soon as I'm able to park the car, I want to have a do-over. I want this story really deserves my full attention. To be able to respond in that way versus get your hand off the door, sit back down in your seat, can be far more impactful to have the child actually follow your lead and go with you, particularly if it's a response you've used and they can trust the relationship. So in the case of complex and developmental trauma, a loved one will probably need more emotional support than others. You may find that emotion coaching has to be used quite repeatedly or over and over and in different contexts. And I would go back to that case conceptualization tool and why that can be helpful. To emotion coach someone is actually really tiring. It's really tiring to position yourself in that way and use your own affect to be able to engage someone through an emotion coach. So if you want to do really targeted, specific intervention with emotion coaching, you have to remember in the context of complex and developmental trauma, you're going to need to do a lot more to build that bridge in the brain. So supporting a caregiver to understand that, often because in this case, the amygdala really is rapid firing. Their internal alarm system is quite sensitive and quite easily set off. Many things are perceived as threat. So in this case, probably you're going to have to do quite a lot more emotional support to be able to soothe the brain and build a bridge. This takes us on to behavior coaching. I really like behavior coaching. And I'm glad that I get the opportunity to talk about it, even in a small way here today, because I find it a helpful aspect. So many times caregivers come into treatment or they bring their kids to treatment and we teach them about emotion coaching. And I don't know if anyone else has had this experience. I have had the experience over and over and over and over again. I just have to agree with them. I just validate. They don't have to listen to me ever. I don't get to set any expectations, anything like that. And I like being able to introduce behavior coaching and say, actually, no, you do need to be able to set really clear boundaries, really clear expectations with any kind of individual, any kind of relationship, particularly if you're talking about an impacted child or youth within their caregiving relationship, because they need those boundaries, they need those limitations, they need to know where the walls are, and behavior coaching allows you to do that. So the goals that come along with behavior coaching really are to interrupt symptoms, promote healthy behaviors and healthy coping, and promote cooperation. And these are the things that parents want us to do, or caregivers want us to do. They want us to get our kids to do these things. So when you get to present that, I also had this thing called behavior coaching, and this is what behavior coaching does, the caregivers are like, yes, give me that thing. That's the one I want right there. And that's where we go into teaching behavior coaching. So these are all the things that we want to target. This is the goal that we land here. So good news, right? This is where we get to go. So what is it? With compassion and confidence, we respectfully set firm limits, communicate appropriate expectations, and we model and teach the skills that are required. And this is where you get to work with the caregiver through their own blocks, which we're going to get to in just a little bit, and also teach a lot of skill. And you get to emotion coach caregivers a whole lot as they get to understand what does it mean to, with compassion and confidence, respectfully set limits, communicate appropriate expectations, and model and teach the skills required. So often we hear they just need to do it. They can't be disrespectful. I'm the grown-up. So we really want to work in those spaces with the caregiver. All of those things that they're saying are really ingrained with very, very significant wisdom around survival and how to interact within the world. So it's not that the caregiver is being a jerk in this particular instance. It really is true that the kid does need to be respectful to go out and interact in the world. The caregiver themselves will support them to learn how to do that teaching in a really compassionate and confident way, and also very respectfully. So when you think about behavior coaching, it has to go hand in hand with emotion coaching. And that's why we teach both and not just one or the other. So you can either behavior coach into an emotion coach, or you can emotion coach into a behavior coach. The two things really are best friends, and you use them together really, really seamlessly. So if you're behavior coaching into emotion coaching, when you're thinking about promoting cooperation or supporting a loved one to like, okay, now it's time to get to therapy, or it's time to do that therapy practice that you were given, or hey, got to go do your homework now. These are some of the steps that can go along with it. The first step, of course, and this is what you're teaching to a caregiver, is, are you calm, and is your expectation reasonable? Because as soon as you come in and you're all either anxious because they're going to stomp all over you, or you're just really fired right up, you're already kind of entering into that battle zone with somebody. And is your expectation reasonable? Does the child have to, are you about to tell your loved one that you're going to sit down and do your homework for the next 6 hours? Or, hey, we're just trying to get into a routine of doing homework. I need you for the next, 10 minutes to do whatever expectation you were set by your teacher. Depending on where you're starting in treatment, it could be anywhere on that spectrum. So knowing that ahead of time, and then before you just, yell across the house and set an expectation, you want to actually connect with them. Sit down and connect with them. And some of the things that I hear from caregivers that are already a little bit, I'm not so sure about this, typically they're going to say to me, so you're telling me every time I connect with my kid, they're going to expect me to set an expectation? Every time I try and engage with them, they're going to think I'm going to give them something to do. And usually what I answer when I'm working with a caregiver is, if the only time you're connecting with your kid is because you want them to do something, yes, that is what they're going to expect from you. So I would encourage you actually to be working with caregivers on other times to connect with kids as well, even when it's really hard, so that, you don't have that association going on, because it's important for caregivers to connect in lots of circumstances. And then you support folks to learn to make the request calmly, confidently, just deliver the command rather than ask it as a bit of a plead. Be concise, using as few words as possible, and then prepare yourself for whatever the emotional response is. And this is where emotion coaching comes together, where you're going to hear the like, oh, I don't want to do that right now, or F you, I'm not going to do what you want me to do, or whatever it is that happens to be said. You just work with the caregiver ahead of time to expect that, so that they know what the response is going to be, or they can guess what the response is going to be. And then you get to practice together in session to be able to take that response and then emotion coach whatever it is. And then you most likely have to make the request a second time. So that's what it looks like to behavior coach into an emotion coach. And then the other side of that is to emotion coach into a behavior coach. So you may have someone that is, incredibly depressed and bedridden, and they can't get up out of bed. And you want to be able to approach them and validate why, of course, it's hard, and then support them to get up and do the thing. So do whatever the therapy homework is, or whatever the sort of assignment is of get up and move. In Elle's case, what you may want to do is think about your behavior coaching landing here when the aunt is saying all the things about, I totally get why you're angry, because this was really important to you and you really wanted to share this with me. You can still do your emotional support. I get why you're so angry. And we know we have a safety situation because Elle's about to jump out of a moving car. We can still give a command, once you validate it. Maybe you don't have time in a really high risk situation. If you do, you can still say, I need you to take your hand off the door and put your seatbelt back on. You can still give a command. So you really have to read the situation, but ultimately you really can just build your behavior coaching into the practical support section of your emotion coaching script. So you can teach parents to do it both ways and use it in a really nimble way, to know it's a tool that you have and you're still focused on shifting behaviors or taking that behavioral approach, which folks often come and ask for. I won't say usually. So how does it fit with complex and developmental trauma? And when we go back to ARC, again, I find it a helpful way to conceptualize. When we think about the attachment layer and what the thing is here, attachment is not all about, and we're not doing an attachment training, but it really isn't all about roses and rainbows. It's also about setting boundaries, being clear in your limits, being very kind and very firm. Those two things are both equally important. So we need to be able to use behavior coaching to set really clear, concise rules, routines, rhythms for anybody. as it goes along. And you want to be able to do that, or you have to be able to do that with managing your own affect and doing it in an attuned way. And that's where the emotion coach piece comes in. Kids are still allowed, anybody is still allowed to have an emotional response to something. And we just want to help them work through that to be able to do the regulation piece that's required. And then it's just an effective way to be able to talk to somebody. So as we continue to move through the components of emotion-focused family therapy, the next on the list would be therapeutic apology. For anyone that's not had the opportunity to attend an EFFT core or EFFT advanced or even a therapeutic apology specific training, I'd very highly recommend it. They've been some of the really meaningful trainings I have had the opportunity to attend. And within the context and the time constraints of today, I'd highlight here really just the purpose or the rationale for the therapeutic apology. As I've talked through today, anyone who may struggle with complex or developmental trauma most likely has a narrative of self-blame. This may present as an individual perceiving themselves as a burden, the cause of all the family struggles, that no one, really has the time or place and shouldn't bother to deal with them. They may isolate, or they may withdraw from caregivers or service providers. And also a narrative of self-blame can also present as other blame, possibly even with overt hostility to you as the therapist, to any treatment team, to the caregiver themselves. So why then, what does a therapeutic apology have to do with that? Well, therapeutic apology is an invitation from a caregiver to the loved one to share the burden of the self-blame. So long as the caregiver themselves can hold in their mind heart that they did the best they could given the circumstances. That's also really important to be able to make this an effective intervention. Doing so can provide relief from feeling broken and ashamed for being a burden, and increase openness to treatment and healing, which is really, really helpful. Therapeutic apology is like the ultimate in relationship repair that we can support in psychotherapy, and really, really helpful in the context of relationship repair and helping someone on their journey to healing. So knowing that relationship repair does not have to be the big guns all the time. Rather, by supporting caregivers and ourselves as therapists to embrace the circle back, we set the tone for regularly repairing ruptures in relationships with our loved ones. So just in the context of relationship repair and why that's important, we're going to mess up. We're going to mess up as therapists. We're going to rupture the relationship. Caregivers are going to mess up in their interactions with their loved ones. And by leaning into the circle back as relationship repair, we really have opportunity to learn from our mistakes. We really have opportunity to live and breathe the very idea that it's not what happened, it is what happens next. We can always move forward. We can always heal old hurt. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but we can work on healing and repairing relationship. So we can circle back to validate your child's, or you can teach a caregiver to circle back to validate their child's sadness from a week ago, their anger from a year ago. And why that's really important within the context of complex and developmental trauma is all of those unprocessed feelings that live within the body, within the nervous system, they're stuck in there until we go back and get them out. So if you're working with that really ingrained pattern of problematic parenting inside the relationship, and you're trying to shift that, there's going to be old hurt that you can support a caregiver to go back and then do the emotion coach to something that happened quite a long time ago as a means to repair relationship and continue to move forward. So in the context of ARC, which helps me, and hopefully just a little bit of a taste of why I would use it to help you, where does it fit inside this? Ultimately, we're talking about all of these things. We're talking about bringing in the effective response for a caregiver, and we're talking about them attuning to things where in the past, perhaps they've misattuned or missed an opportunity to connect, missed an opportunity to support their loved one to do their own emotional processing. And to be able to do this, you really do have to focus on caregiver affect management and helping a caregiver really regulate their own stuff. I can say there's probably nothing worse than receiving an apology where somebody just comes in, or a circle back that says, yeah, I know you were angry, but you really had that coming to you. So perhaps I could have been kinder to you in that moment, but you deserve that, versus really helping them, sort of a caregiver, work through whatever that hurt is that they're still stuck with in session with you, so that they can go back and be able to say, like, hey, you were really angry with me last week. And I get that because I didn't respond really helpfully and I kind of tried to shut you down right away. And yeah, I get why you were really angry. That makes a lot of sense. You know, I wish what I would have done is taken the time to hear what you were saying to me. There's no reason that you can't support a caregiver to go back and do that, because it really is an opportunity for them to go and address that feeling that is absolutely still stuck inside someone's feeling and will drive a wedge into the relationship and also that person's path to healing. Caregiver blocks. When thinking about the likelihood of intergenerational patterns of complex trauma, it's important to understand parents really are doing the best that they can. They've lived and breathed and learned how to parent or not based on their own histories of receiving care and their own interactions with the world from their parents, from their caregivers. As individuals, as human beings, we can only do or not do what we know. And this bolsters the wisdom of caregivers' problematic patterns of parenting. They really are operating from a place of love and care and support, even if it doesn't look like that on the outside. So in thinking about the question then, is it the parent's fault when a kid is impacted by complex developmental trauma? I would say no. Parents do the best they can, and sometimes those actions are damaging. That's undeniable. However, in the context that we're talking about here, that intergenerational pattern of complex and developmental trauma, parents are just as much trying to survive as their children. So often, caregivers themselves really are the same as their little person. They're just in a big body. And they themselves are really impacted by their own histories, whether they're aware of it or they're not. And they are doing the best they can. They're really invested in the survival of the children, of their own children, their own loved one. They're invested in helping that kiddo or that young adult survive in the world as they themselves, the caregiver, perceives it. And so you get some of these tough love approaches. For me, I have found to stay firmly grounded in the value and belief that people are always doing the best they can, and encourages me to look for the wisdom in a caregiver's actions. Once I can see this, I can join with them and hold space by emotion coaching them. Even when what they're saying, I think, oh, I don't know about that. If I can understand the wisdom behind it, I can emotion coach them and I can join with them to help them see that there is wisdom behind that. To emotion coach a caregiver that's most likely been overtly blamed and share with them the genuine understanding through your because statements and then your emotional support, you can form some real connection and trust to be able to practically support their learning and implementation of new skills, more effective responses. Whether that be on their own regulation and distress tolerance skills in the face of the inevitable triggers we all face in caregiving. And these are only exacerbated through histories and intergenerational patterns, or how they support their loved one to learn to use new skills and manage their affect and get their needs met in a more adaptive way. The same sentiment holds true for foster and adoptive caregivers and kin caregivers as well, and I wanted to address that. In my experience, these caregivers can be just as blocked as a family of origin caregiver, sometimes more so, in their care of loved ones who've experienced complex trauma. I hear a lot of, they should just get over it. That was a long time ago. They've been with me for so long. That early stuff shouldn't matter anymore. I am not getting paid enough for this. This one is impacting the rest of the family and they got to go. They get them out. Well, all of this is certainly hard to hear, and it is. It's also true that these statements are still grounded in wisdom and can represent blocks in caregivers. So how do we address these blocks? We can emotion coach a caregiver. And then EFFT also comes along with some pretty handy dandy tools that help us work through through caregiver blocks. We have the tree metaphor, which we're going to look at again, caregiving patterns or the animal models, which hopefully many have seen, the relationship dimensions tool, and the caregiver trap skill. All really, really helpful, which should also say on here our caregiver block chair work. So the tree here really can be helpful to help a caregiver really reflect and understand what's going on for them as they are doing these things in the relationship with their child. And what you'll notice here that's quite different about the beginning and really helpful to help caregivers see that you get it, but also for me as a clinician anyway, to understand that these things are all grounded in love and they are fueled by burnout. And when that's the case, these become big, and then these become even bigger. So to be able to work through this and either do psychoeducation for the caregiver, why they themselves, or perhaps why their loved one is acting the way they're acting, it can be really, really impactful to help a caregiver understand what's up for them, what's up for their co-parent, but also what's up for their kid or their loved one. We also have the animal models, which I hope folks have had an opportunity to go through. And these are, patterns that folks fall into in really, really extreme stressful situations in the context of their caregiving relationship with their loved ones, where you can respond to emotion and difficult circumstances as a jellyfish with a pouch, perhaps an ostrich with a horn. I myself, big rhino here, big rhino with lots of feathers. So I know that about myself, and it's helpful to walk with caregivers through this to understand what happens for them, what's their go-to when their kiddos are putting them in really stressful situations and they're just trying to manage, or when they themselves are. So this can be an incredibly helpful tool. And certainly I've had caregivers that say, get these animal models out of my face. Like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. And others that are like, holy cow, I'm the biggest kangaroo I've ever met. You should see the size of my pouch. And they're just like, yes, that's me. And they just really identify with what's going on, because it's really user-friendly and it's playful and it's not blamey. It's just really, we all do this. And I readily identify my rhino-ness, and you'll be happy to know my children would as well. If they walked into the room, they would cheerfully point out all my feathers and my giant horn. Very, very helpful tool. The relationship dimensions scale is also an incredibly helpful tool. I say this about everything. Everything's incredibly helpful. I'm just so excited about all of this stuff, because it's really, for me, something that I found over the years where I was like, holy cow, this gives me opportunity to get in there with caregivers. Sometimes we teach them, and we think, why can't you do the thing? And the things that come along with EFFT have been so impactful. So hence my excitement. The relationship dimension scale here is really just a scale, and you can have caregivers mark kind of where they fall on the spectrum of all of these things, and then you can pick some of the biggest outliers, and you can work specifically on those for caregivers, asking them just to make a step toward the middle. And as they start to make a step toward the middle, or they contemplate making a step toward the middle, you also get a really good picture of what the block is, what comes up for them, what does it look like. That's when you get to see them rhino or kangaroo or jellyfish or anything like that. You get a good picture of it, because they're probably going to tell you about what they think about your suggestions. And then you get to work through it and understand it. And for me, I like to tie the two things together as I'm getting to know someone or starting to work on their blocks, of then taking what comes up for you as you think about taking a step toward the middle, and really narrow focusing it down more into the caregiver trap scale here, where folks can identify with a specific thought or rationale or worry. And this is where you get to really intimately know what's the wisdom. What is the wisdom that's driving this caregiver's pattern as they think about making shifts or approaching their child in a different way, their loved one in a different way. And through here, they can circle, and you get to pick your outliers, sort of the highest scored one or two or three, to see really what's going on for them. And then you can really start to work on it. Once you know it, then you can get involved with it, and you can work on it with them. And then we talk about big guns. You have your caregiver block chair work. So again, you can learn more about this and what it looks like and how to do such a thing by attending a 3-day core, and day 3's time is spent on caregiver block work or advanced training. I think I'm fairly certain on the Mental Health Foundation site, there is a video, I think by Adele, where she demonstrates caregiver block work. If you haven't had opportunity to see it, I encourage you to check it out. Which is really, really, as I say, the big guns to be able to help someone move through a block when it's really, really stuck, really, really ingrained. It's a very, very evocative opportunity to just really move through the emotion and have it processed with you to move ahead. So why do we work on caregiver blocks? As they say, they're part of the caregiving system. I have found it helpful. And in the context of ARC, why have I found it so helpful? When you're working on a caregiver's blocks that are coming up in their relationship with their loved ones, you actually position yourself as the attachment layer to the caregiver themselves. So you're doing these things. You're effectively responding. You're using emotion coaching them to attune to why they're struggling, to really understand and managing your own affect, which of course we all do as professional therapists. And we've all had moments where we slip and things don't go as well. However, we really position ourselves here to be able to help the caregiver themselves work on their own regulation, to help them work on the identification and modulation of those big feelings that come up inside blocks so that they can get to know them and make different choices. It allows their executive functions, their thinking, to come back online, and they can figure out which aspects of these blocks are tied up in their own development and identity so that they can focus on the relational connection that they need to do with their kiddo. And by doing that in a really focused way, helping a caregiver through their own blocks, accomplishing this for them, you really are helping them integrate themselves in the context of their caregiving to then allow them to do this piece for their loved one and support the loved one on their path to healing. So the last component here is clinician blocks. And I would say all of this stuff, I've been so excited and so helpful. Clinician blocks have been so impactful for me as a therapist working with caregivers. And I say this because you use the same tools, many of the same tools you're going to talk about in caregiver blocks on yourself as a clinician, thinking of yourself stuck in relationship or in your work. And you're going to get stuck. You're going to get blocked. Stuff is going to come up for you. That's not a failure. Acknowledging it and working through it will make you a more powerful therapist, a more effective therapist. And frankly, it will make the work easier. For me, my experience, it makes the work easier because it becomes less stressful when I can understand which aspects of myself get caught up. However, we're exposed to some pretty hard to hear stories when we're working with children and youth that have complex and developmental trauma. There's hard stories, there's hard circumstances, and caregivers themselves are really, really stuck in problematic patterns of parenting that can be really hard to watch and see. And there are definitely times where we're going to say, like, what's wrong with this caregiver? They're never going to be able to do it. Or alternately, as an example for me, one of the times I got tremendously blocked, can be kind of pushy of caregivers in session, but there came a time I didn't want to push a particular caregiver. And I had to do a lot of block work, a lot of different times to figure out what that was. And I was really, really worried if I pushed her too hard, she was going to take her own life. And I was so blocked by this particular thing, this particular worry, that I couldn't actually help her move ahead in her behavior coaching with her child, which is what really needed to happen in that particular moment. So clinician blocks are something I encourage everyone everywhere that's doing this work to really sink your teeth into and think about how are you being impacted and what blocks are coming up for you. As I say, it's not a failure to be blocked. It's simply an aspect of doing the work. So I would encourage folks to consider that. So those are the components of emotion-focused family therapy and how I see in a very speedy way how emotion-focused family therapy can be helpful. So